Hi, everybody. We're going to be taking a look today at the end of the Clinton presidency. We'll talk about his foreign policy and largely finish up with the 1990s. So before we begin, I want to make sure I take questions from all of y'all. So does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns before we begin? Okay. So today we'll be finishing up the 90s. The first thing I want to discuss is the Clinton foreign policy. And so we'll be taking a look at Clinton's foreign policy. We'll talk about how it ultimately impacts the rest of his presidency and essentially finish up everything all the way to 2000, which is really kind of the ending point for this class. Now I know some of you maybe want to talk about 9/11 and issues that come after, and those might be covered in a later lecture. We'll see as far as how the course changes, because as of right now, it's basically 1877 to 2000-ish, but that might change in the future. So, but anyway, today we're going to take a look at the 1990s. So let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. So 1990s, we discussed last time the Clinton presidency. William Clinton, Bill, as he was affectionately known, becomes president in 1992. He is responsible for a booming economy, a dot-com buzz that takes place during the 90s. As technology partnerships begin to be formed, NAFTA comes into full effect. And we also had kind of hinted at some of the scandals of the Clinton presidency, which we'll really go into more detail about today. So first of all, let's talk about foreign policy. Clinton was going to have a foreign policy that we refer to essentially as the post-Cold War. What does the United States do in this new environment? Remember that the whole shebang from the 40s all the way to the 90s was about gearing up to fight the Soviet Union. And then in 1991, Soviet Union collapsed. So most of our fighter jets, our tanks, our military strategy was largely designed to contain the Soviet Union. And if you remember all the way back to the 1950s lecture, one of the things that we talked about was this idea of containment, right? George Kennan's famous Foreign Affairs article, where he talked about the best way to defeat the Soviets was to basically contain them. And that although it might take a while, that it will eventually be effective. And so that strategy did work, but it took 40, 50 years for it to ultimately come into fruition. And there was a lot of things that are responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union. We discussed those in the previous lecture. But Clinton is really kind of left with the pieces of what to do. America, I think, is even today still trying to find its feet as to where we fit in this new world order of sorts, and how we ultimately are going to deal with the fact that we don't have a boogeyman called the Soviet Union to blame anymore. Some would argue that we just made terrorism the new bad guy, and so now that's the whole purpose, is to contain Iran and these countries that we call terror states. So that's possible. I mean, one of the ways of thinking about that is to look at American interventions, in the last 10, 20 years. And you've got Afghanistan, you've got essentially Iraq. These are, countries that border Iran. And so, trying to create kind of the same, metal coffin of sorts that we use for the Soviet Union, maybe that Iran is the new boogeyman. Whether that's is true or not is largely up to you. I'm sure people who work in foreign affairs could argue yes or no, but we're still dealing with it. We're trying to figure out where do we fit. What do we do now as the lone superpower that's left in the world? So ultimately, one of the first issues is Clinton. How does he deal with this? And it begins with the selection of his Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who's going to serve for most of his term. And one of the first major issues that Albright and Clinton are going to encounter is essentially the issue in Mogadishu, right, in Somalia. You guys probably know it better as Black Hawk Down because of the feature film that came out, I think, in 2002, 2003. I think it was Ridley Scott. So anyway, the situation was that during the Bush presidency, there were just daily airings of kids in Africa that were starving to death and dying. And you see some of these even today, like the Christian Funds Network, and there's, all these different, charitable organizations that basically deal with it. And then, you see these kids that are starving to death, and they say, Christopher doesn't know when he's going to eat again, and your $5, a month could, make sure that he has something to eat. So whether or not that stuff actually ends up in the hands of the people it's supposed to, several of them have been indicted for fraud. But, the ultimate idea was in the 80s, people were receptive to this. They saw people suffering around the world and they wanted to do something about it. So Somalia was one of the most war-racked countries on the planet. Somalia was still dealing with the legacy of its colonialism. It had been taken over by the Italians, and they'd basically just kind of left it to its own devices. And a warlord had taken power in Somalia by the name of Adid. And Adid essentially was taking all of this money that was coming in from UNICEF, and he was using it to buy drugs and guns for his gang members. So Somalia, instead of being a country that had a lot of food, the money that was coming in that was supposed to buy food and supplies and medical supplies was being siphoned off to create his own private militia. So the US wanted to do something about this, and during the Clinton administration, the idea was to send special forces guys in to capture Adid and essentially to bring him up on crimes of war crimes, to bring him on trial. And that's what the ultimate goal of Black Hawk Down was to go into Mogadishu, which was the capital city of Somalia, and to essentially arrest Adid and his henchmen and then get out quickly before the militia had a chance to strike. Well, although the initial operation was successful, they didn't get Adid. They ended up, being in the wrong place. Two Blackhawks ended up being shot down with RPGs. And when that happened, it really changed the nature of the mission from one that was kind of a shoot and scoot, get in and out, to one that became much longer. And so, Army Rangers and units were basically stranded in Somalia for some time. After the Black Hawk Down incident, several American military personnel were killed. We don't really know how many Somalis were killed. A lot. Certainly, because there was a lot of open warfare taking place in the streets, and not only were military people being killed, but certainly civilians were being killed as well. And so eventually in 1994, once this event took place, this spurred the Clinton administration to pull out of Somalia. And so American assistance for Somalia became very tiny after this. So it basically showed the nature of post-Cold War policies. There really wasn't a boogeyman to blame all evil on anymore. And where third world countries used to be strategically important, now nobody really gave a shit about them, because countries like Somalia were poor, didn't have a lot of resources that we wanted, and so there really wasn't a lot of American interest in continuing to go there. Americans weren't going to risk American lives on a country we didn't care about, and that's ultimately, I think, the ultimate legacy of Somalia. Right? Any questions on Mogadishu and Somalia? They also were a large center for piracy. I know it's hard to believe that there's Jack Sparrows in the world today, and they certainly don't look like Jack Sparrow, but there are pirates today, and Somalia is a pirate haven. Obviously, when they come close to the U.S. Navy, they try to get as far away from it as possible, but there is still piracy. There is still piracy on the high seas, and some of it comes from Somalia. It's still a poor country. Other questions? Okay, so there's also some of the hints of terrorism, right? We talked about the Lockerbie bombings. We talked about what was going on during the Bush and the Reagan eras. Under Clinton, we begin to see that a series of groups that were led by a henchman by the name of Osama bin Laden claimed responsibilities for bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The Clinton administration authorized attack on terror training camps in Afghanistan, and they froze all of bin Laden's assets in the United States. But this wasn't going to be the end of it. There's even stories that they had a definite fix on Osama bin Laden's location in '95, and Clinton basically said no. The reasons for why he said no, I don't know. You can check his biography and see why he made that decision. But there's a possibility they could have, stopped 9/11 potentially from happening. Again, it's ipso facto. It's already happened, and we don't know how things would have been different if they would have targeted, bin Laden himself. But ultimately, the ideas of terrorism are starting to culminate. We're starting to realize that, there are all these other countries out there that want to hurt us and want to do bad stuff to us. Bosnia is another example where we talked a little bit about this during the Bush administration, but basically at the end of World War I, Yugoslavia was created. And this was not a good thing because there was no such thing as a Yugoslav. Yugoslavia was just a giant area that was made up of as many as 40 different ethnic groups, many different religions, places that had been part of different empires throughout history. And so they just drew a bunch of borders around something and then expected them to play nice. Well, while the Soviets were there, they did, because the Soviets had, 30 divisions in Eastern Europe. But the moment that there was no longer a big brother watching them, they started fighting amongst themselves. And the Serbians, who were the chief group, started killing all of those that they didn't like, in particular, people from Kosovo. Kosovo was made up of a lot of people, Albanians and others that were Muslim. And the Serbians, being strict Orthodox Christian, really didn't like them. And so they started murdering them. And a campaign of what we would call ethnic cleansing. And it was Slobodan Milosevic, who was the president of Serbia, that was largely responsible for this. And so UN troops were inserted to protect Kosovo. The US provided a no-fly zone in which U.S. Airplanes would fly over to make sure that they weren't trying to bring in anything untoward. And eventually, with the work of a coalition, and particularly with the UN, Slobodan Milosevic was forced to resign, and he was later tried and convicted of war crimes at The Hague. And so this is one of those examples of where Clinton was looked at as being a team player, as being someone who worked with the international community, where some future presidents like GW would not. They didn't care that they went it alone. So Clinton was very different in that regard. Russia is another great example. I think that Russia shows kind of some of the best aspects of the Clinton presidency. Clinton had a very good relationship with Boris Yeltsin, who was the first president of Russia. And the two of them got along quite well as Russia was making this transition to what we would call democracy. The Americans were there to help by providing loans and assistance, something that people in the 60s would think, America loaning money to the Soviets or former Soviets, how is this possible? But because of the good relationship between the two, I think it helped them to have a good relationship, and that helped to smooth things out as far as relations. So Yeltsin was able to essentially bring Russia into the modern world, establishing them as part of the World Trade Organization. He was also able to get them to become part of many other economic policies and pacts that would affect the U.S., troop reductions in nuclear arsenals, all of these kinds of things to make the world, a somewhat safer place than what it was before. And obviously Yeltsin and Clinton, they got along very well. And so I think it's because these two guys liked each other that it helped this situation tremendously, right? Now in 1999, because Yeltsin was unable to deal with a lot of Russia's big problems like unemployment and the transition to democracy, it's a big undertaking to go from being one government system to another and do it in a short period of time. So I think that Yeltsin kind of became the scapegoat for a lot of Russian problems. Crime rose in Russia significantly. The Russian mafia gained large control over parts of the countryside. And so because of this, he was forced to resign in 1999. And power at this point passed to Vladimir Putin, who we're all familiar with, right? Because as of 2021, he's the current sitting president of Russia. Putin was a former KGB agent. He basically did not get along well with Clinton. Putin was a guy who likes to play his cards close to his chest. He's not a guy that you're going to see being very jovial and happy and dancing around like Yeltsin did. Yeltsin would get drunk and dance on national TV. Putin was much more measured. And because of that, I think that him and Clinton didn't have as good a relationship as Yeltsin did. So relations kind of go down a little, certainly, but we're going to see that, Putin is going to try to remake Russia into what it had been. I think Putin's ultimate goal is to bring back the Soviet Union, and he's worked in a lot of ways towards that, whether it be meddling in American elections, whether it be messing with American power around the globe, hacking American computers, flying bombers into our airspace just on purpose to see what the American response times are. Those are all examples of things that Putin does on a pretty regular basis. So 1999, we have the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, which all joined NATO, right, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Former Soviet states that had been part of the Warsaw Pact now become part of America's alliance system. NATO still exists today. Nobody's really sure what it's supposed to do because its ultimate goal was to keep the Soviet Union out, but maybe Russia, right? With a resurgent Russia, maybe NATO's purpose will be renewed. It's certainly one of those questions that will go into the future. In 93, there was a bomb detonated at the World Trade Center. A guy by the name of Ramzi Youssef was extradited for this and received life imprisonment as a result. The U.S. Cole was bombed. 12 American sailors were killed as a boat basically, came up to the side of a U.S. ship and then blew a hole in it. So these are examples of terrorism, both domestic and foreign. Also, we begin to see that the Clinton administration is going to work for peace in the Middle East. That's going to be obviously difficult to do because even today, peace has still not been achieved. There's still issues regarding who should actually own Palestine and who ultimately belongs there. But ultimately, the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat is going to work with Israel and also, of course, with Clinton to try to find some kind of settlement. They signed a 6-year peace settlement, which created the Palestinian state. Israeli troops were drawn from the West Bank and Gaza. Um, it's a temporary solution. Obviously, today things are heating up in those areas even to this day. So the reality is that Clinton's kind of towing a line between the more hardcore elements of the Israeli parties and the more hardcore elements of the Palestinians as well. And even today, there's still issues between the two as far as what's going to happen. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein continues power. Most thought that he would crawl back into his hole at the end of the Persian Gulf War, but he was able to maintain control by gassing the Kurds and those that stood against him. And so Saddam Hussein, basically, every once in a while, he would screw with the inspectors. UN inspectors were appointed to make sure that he had no weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein would frequently skirt those rulings or kick the inspectors out, which led them to believe that other things were going on. Clinton was not willing to send troops in to physically find out, but later that would happen in the 2003 invasion, which will take place under GW. So obviously in places like Palestine, there aren't a lot of pro-American sentiments because particularly in Palestine, the unemployment rate is like 70%. People don't have jobs. It's hot. They can't support their families. And so in many of these places, suicide bombers are revered. And the reason for that is because people don't have the opportunity to make a living, right? Palestine's a poor country. It's not an area that's filled with natural resources. And so, when they have no other alternative, that's what they do, right? They basically decide that they're going to do this. Now, I'm not saying that, it's justified, right? Because anytime you murder other human beings, there's going to be consequences. And certainly the Israelis have a right to protect themselves. But it's a situation that continues today. Neither side can reach an agreement as to what is to be done with the Palestinians and how are we to figure out how this works. The Palestinians certainly were there before the Israelis were, so they definitely have a claim to that land the same way the Israelis do. But who should ultimately own it, right, ultimately becomes a question of conjecture. So you're free to make your own conjectures and take your own position as far as which side of the fence you actually are on in that regard. Any questions on peace in the Middle East and Clinton's attempts to try to realize them? So one of the questions is, why is it so hard to create a peace settlement between both sides? Because you're dealing with thousands of years of history, all right? So you've got Jews that occupied it, right? And they took it from somebody else, the Canaanites. And initially, if you read the book of Joshua in the Bible, right, Joshua is essentially the book of conquest, right? The conquest of what eventually would become known as Israel, right? The land of Judah. And eventually the Israelis got conquered, right, by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and then eventually the Persians. And then they got conquered by the Macedonians, and then they got conquered by the Romans, and it just went on and on and on. And so eventually the Jews still did not have a state as of 1948 when the UN voted to make this happen, which I think we talked about with the Harry Truman chapter. And so the issue is who owns it? Well, all kinds of people have owned it at one point or another. And so who it truly belongs to is still, it's a difficult question. And you can't answer that question because it's belonged to so many different people at so many different parts of history. And so the Israelis did buy large swaths of land from the Palestinians in 48. The Palestinians believed that they were given a bad deal. The Israelis said, you already signed. That's how it works. Some of them were muscled out of their territories. I mean, and it's both sides. There's issues that take place in both. So I'm not going to be one that says that one side's right and one side's wrong. Both sides are going to have to compromise. And the reality is that neither side is willing to go to extreme compromises. They'll give up little bits here and there, like the Golan Heights or that kind of thing, but they're not, going to give up all of it. And that's one of the big problems that you've got at play. So you got thousands of years of history. You've got, people who don't like each other. You've got people who feel that they've been wronged. You've got international community that, sometimes cares and sometimes doesn't. And it's a big mess. All right, so other issues, massive trade deficits. This really began with the Nixon administration and has continued to the present day. Part of the reason that we are trillions of dollars in debt at the time of this lecture is because the United States always spends more than we take in. And when you do that over years, decades, it starts to add up. And certainly with trade, that's what happens, particularly as America becomes closer to Japan and China. We lose a lot of money on our trade with those countries. We buy far more from China and Japan than we sell back to them. And so this ultimately hurts us with the idea of trying to balance a budget. Now, Clinton will be very interesting. The Clinton presidency is the only presidency that I know of in my lifetime that had a balanced budget at one time. I think in 98 or 99, there was a balanced budget for the first time in years, but it did not last long. And certainly with the wars after 9/11 and a lot of things that are going on today, we're not even close to having a balanced budget today. But that was something that did happen under Clinton for a brief period, but it didn't last very long. The United States has pretty much always spent more money than it takes in. So when you see these guys arguing that, oh, if the United States was a business, it would go bankrupt. Well, governments rarely go bankrupt because governments create money. So the real issue you'd be worried about, which we talked about with the Great Depression, is inflation. Eventually the money will become so useless you just can't use it anymore. And then at that point, that's when you're gonna have a real problem. Then you can look up Weimar Germany and see what happens there. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you can take World Civ II and we talk about the history of Germany and Hitler's rise to power and how all that kind of stuff happens. But it happens because the economy was in shambles. If Weimar had done a good job and if the economy had done well, then crackpots like Hitler would have never had a chance to take power. Other questions? Okay. All right, so we talked about the START treaties, which reduced the nuclear armaments. As far as the economy, we discussed the fact that it was booming. 18 million jobs were added by the turn of the century. Tech giants like Microsoft became huge names. Walmart is going to have some of its best years ever in the 1990s, where it becomes a major conglomerate even today. Most retail has been put out of business by Walmart. Target's kind of limping on, but we used to have, I remember 4 or 5, we had a Kmart. There was an Osco Drug. I'm trying to think of just places that we had in my hometown that all got put out of business by Walmart. And so the reality is that there are 18 million jobs added by the end of the century, but are they full-time fantastic jobs? Some of them, and some of them are. A lot of them are temp jobs. Jobs that as soon as the, like gift wrappers during the holiday season where you're employed for a couple of months while they need you and then they don't need you anymore, they cut you loose. Those temp jobs are very common in the US and they're at all levels. My first 2 years as a professor was a temp. I didn't get insurance. I think I made like $5,000 a year or something. It's sad. It sucks. But the reality is those are the kinds of jobs that were being created. Not all of them were going to be careers. Some of them were just temp jobs as well. As far as poverty rates, during the Clinton administration, Blacks and Hispanics still had a much higher poverty rate. And when it came to the new tech firms that were opening up and the economy that was opening up, many of these jobs just were not available to people of color. The reason being that many of these poor groups didn't have access to the quality educations that you needed. Taking coding classes and what we would refer to as STEM education. A lot of the inner city schools were considered subpar. Even today, many inner city schools are still considered subpar as compared to some of the rural ones. And so because of that, it was part of this vicious cycle that continued to make minorities poorer and poorer. Today, obviously, there are some avenues out of that, but many of these ideas still continue. Right? People who grow up poor in the inner cities usually lack the skills, right, to be able to go to those upper level institutions. And so as a result, their futures are pretty bleak. And so, you end up, wanting to be an athlete or you end up trying to go in the NFL or whatever, because, if your school sucks and you don't have the skills, there's not a lot of avenues open to you. So those are all examples of things that in the 80s and 90s, people were becoming more aware of as problems, particularly in the inner cities. And there's some inner cities, even in the United States today, if you go to Detroit and other places, they look like, something that it came out of either a horror movie or a war movie. They look bombed out. Right? You see where apartments have fallen down and where, clean water isn't even available and the sewer systems are overflowing, right? In Flint, Michigan, it's exactly what was happening. So this is the kind of stuff that happens in the US, guys. It's not just something that happens in third world countries. It happens here at home too. Something you just wouldn't believe, but it does happen. All right. So the gap between rich and poor is becoming wider. Um, these are all examples of things that are happening here. You can see, of course, Walmart growing. And it's not that I have a thing against Walmart. It's just that, Walmart's kind of a symptom of the growing economy of the 90s. A lot of temp workers, people who aren't going to have insurance, no guarantee of further employment, job satisfaction ratings usually pretty low. Maybe you work at Walmart and love it. That's great. But that's, a lot of retail businesses expanded during the 90s. It's not like, these were big firms where people were going to have, huge amounts of money to support their families. And so here you can see, of course, the deficits and the surpluses. So 98, 99, 2000, and 2001 featured surpluses. Obviously, the trend you can see after it is deficits. And certainly we continue that trend even today. Any questions before we move on to the impeachment crisis? Okay, so I know in the chat I've gotten a bunch of questions about the impeachment scandal, and this is one of the things that everybody seems to remember Bill Clinton about. The first thing I'll say is that, remember, this is an adult class and we talk about adult themes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about adult things, all right? And if you don't want to hear it, then you can close your ears, right? But this is, it's a rated R, right? It's a rated R lecture, so just be prepared to understand what happens. So first of all, Bill Clinton had scandals that had followed him since he was, just beginning to become a politician. The scandals and the Clintons, they had a very special relationship. And so what had happened was in 1997, a former Arkansas state employee by the name of Paula Jones had essentially sued Clinton for sexual harassment. The story was that they had been on the road somewhere and that she had been told to go up to Clinton's room. When she arrived there, she'd opened the door and Clinton came out and exposed himself to her. Okay. That was her position. That lawsuit was settled for $850,000. So again, they had NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. So whether he did or he didn't, he settled it. All right. So some would say that right there tells you what you need to know. Others would say, well, maybe he was, under political pressure and he just did it so that it would go away. Whatever you believe is up to you. If you're a Clinton supporter, certainly you'll believe one thing. And if you're somebody who wants to believe something else, then that's up to you. So that's the first one, right? The Paula Jones scandal. Now, another issue that had followed Clinton was what was known as Whitewater, right? Whitewater was a real estate scam where they'd invested a bunch of money into these various real estate dealings, and they'd all gone south. And the Clintons had jumped ship, and they didn't really lose a whole lot, but everybody else did. So it was believed that the Clintons had defrauded these people. And when they looked at it, the Clintons just said it's just bad luck. I mean, anytime you invest into something, there's the possibility it won't go your way. So that was another issue that was being looked at, right, while Clinton was in the White House. The third one, which I think is the one that most people remember, is the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Okay. Monica Lewinsky was an intern who had worked in the White House, and she had some run-ins with Bill Clinton, right? But nothing that anybody had really had an issue with. Where things had kind of blown up was that Monica Lewinsky was friends with a woman by the name of Linda Tripp, right? Who was also a White House employee. And Linda Tripp, right, wanted to be a talk show host, right? Her goal was to be like Ricky Lake, which I know most of you are like, who the hell's Ricky Lake? But Ricky Lake was a very popular talk show host, a tabloid. It was basically just like, like the Maury Povich, right? You are not the father. And the guy's like, dancing and stuff. That was Ricky Lake. And then there was Ginny Jones and there was Sally Jesse Raphael. And those were all examples of shows that were kind of in the same thing. The chat box says, what about Jerry Springer? Jerry Springer is a whole different thing. These were like people talking about, they were like white trash sitting down talking about how terrible life was. Jerry Springer is just even lower than that. It's like the absolute lowest common denominator. Yeah, it's like you put racists and Black Panthers on a show and then see what happens. Of course they're going to fight. You put these opposite groups up there, and then it's a shock talk show. there's not a lot of issues being talked about on Jerry Springer. Those guys aren't trying to fix their behaviors. It's basically just a circus that you can watch. That's really what it is. In fact, I think he had a movie that came out during the period called Ringmaster, where, I mean, he very much embraced the idea that he was basically like the top hat wearing guy in the circus. It's a circus. That's the point. So this is a little different, but she wanted to be like a gossip talk show host, right? Kind of like Wendy Williams today, I think would be a good example. And so the way that she was going to do that was that she had gotten together with some conservatives that didn't like Bill Clinton, and they had arranged for her to wear a wire, right? And so while she was there, she was secretly taping her conversations, her lunches with Monica Lewinsky. And Lewinsky basically talked about various sexual liaisons that she had had with Bill Clinton, the president, and how they were hooking up in the White House. And so Tripp basically took the tapes and gave them to a special attorney, a special counsel by the name of Kenneth Starr. And they basically they were already looking into Whitewater, and this was a totally different thing that they started looking into. And this one was the issue that Bill Clinton was having an affair. Now, here's the thing to understand. It is not illegal to have an affair. I would not say it's good practice because your wife's probably going to kill you. But the reality is it's not against the law to have one. So Bill Clinton was not prosecuted for having an affair. What he was prosecuted for was lying about it. Okay. When you give statements or depositions to the FBI, you can be put in jail for lying to the FBI. Okay. So when he had made statements, the rumors had circulated about the Lewinsky scandal, and they had asked him under oath, right? Did you and Miss Lewinsky have sexual relations? And Bill Clinton's response, which you can still see, is still one of his more famous quips that's out there, was, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And you can hear him say it. Okay. So they have him on tape, right, as part of a deposition saying that he never had sexual relations with her, but yet they have Monica Lewinsky saying that they did. So this is where an investigation takes place. And that's essentially what Kenneth Starr did, was to investigate the nature of the relationship and how it applied. Okay. So they were basically trying to say that Bill Clinton had lied about what was going on, about the sexual liaisons that were taking place. So the question is, why do people care about whether or not the president has sex in the White House? Well, most people didn't. But the issue at play was he a liar? Right? The Republicans wanted Clinton out because they wanted to put their own guy in. So they saw this as a political opportunity to get rid of a rival. In this case, Bill Clinton. Right? And then drag it, and at the very least, drag his name through the mud, right? So that he couldn't oppose them anymore when they tried to pass stuff. It was definitely a political maneuver by Republicans. Okay, so I knew I'd get this question. What kinds of sexual acts were taking place? Well, according to Miss Lewinsky, basically what she had talked about was that basically Bill Clinton was getting a blowjob. That she would give him a blowjob under the desk, right? And then there was a conversation about how he had sexual relations with her with a cigar. And I don't have to fill in the rest for you. I'm pretty sure you can figure it out yourselves. So if you would have watched the trial, they actually brought in a dress that Miss Lewinsky had that had Bill Clinton's semen on it. They brought in all of this evidence that his pants that he'd worn from that day where he had gone. And they were using this. This was all in public. Everybody saw this. And so it was like the Jenny Jones show. I mean, everybody would tune in, not necessarily to see what was going on legally, but to see, man, what did the president do? You know, what kinds of stuff was going on? We want to know. And that's the kind of stuff that followed both of them for the rest of their careers. Even today, Monica Lewinsky is still known as that girl that fooled around with Bill Clinton. Certainly Hillary was mortified, but Hillary, made a statement where she said, I stand by my man. Even though we are very certain that this is probably not the only time that Bill Clinton had done this. Clinton had affairs probably with other women as well, because the way it was done was, they would schedule them in the office at the appropriate time and nobody was there at that time. And It was put into his schedule that this stuff was going to take place. So the reality is that it dragged. I think the important thing is not necessarily what was going on. The important thing is what did it do? It dragged the presidency through the mud. That people, SNL on a nightly basis was talking about this. That all the talk shows loved it because it was just the greatest fodder you could imagine for jokes. And so the presidency became a joke. And the highest office in the land became a joke, and everybody wanted to talk about how Clinton was getting a BJ, and that dominated the local news. It dominated the culture of that time. Now, eventually, what they did was they brought Clinton up on charges. In fact, Bill Clinton was impeached. Impeachment, remember, is the ability or the attempt to try to get rid of a sitting president, and they brought charges against Clinton for lying under oath, because he'd given that statement where he said he didn't have sexual relations. So you might say, well, they've got him dead to rights because they've got his DNA on her shirt. We know that this was going on. So what does Clinton do? Clinton's lawyers essentially argued that to Bill Clinton, oral sex and cigar sex is not vaginal sex. So because of that, Clinton wasn't lying. So one of the comments says, wow, that's a really good defense. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the basic idea is that they argued that it wasn't vaginal sex, so it doesn't count. That Clinton's definition when he gave that statement was that he did not have vaginal sex with Monica Lewinsky. And that's it. And so when the trial took place, it was divided. Most of the Republicans voted to get rid of him, and most of the Democrats voted for. And there were a few in the middle that went both ways. It ultimately led to Clinton being found he was not guilty. They didn't get the 66% that they needed to get him out of office. So Clinton later admitted that his conduct was wrong. He shouldn't have done it. But he didn't lie about it because his definition of sex was much narrower than most people. Most people would argue that those would be forms of sex. Clinton would say that they're not. And by his own definition, he did not lie. Comments, questions? I don't think that it was a trial really to get Bill Clinton out of office. I think it was a trial to embarrass him. I think there were Republicans that had an axe to grind with Clinton. They didn't like him. And I think that they used this as a form of vengeance, honestly. When most American people were polled as to what they thought about it, most Americans would have voted to acquit because to them, they didn't care. As long as the economy was going well, as long as their taxes were going down, didn't matter to them. They could care less what the president does in his private time. I don't know if it would be the same today. That's a good question. The chat box. That's a really good question. I don't know. I think Americans today are much more soapboxy than they were in 1990. There was an idea that what a Clinton or a president would do in his own time was up to him. Today, I think it's not that way as much anymore. Maybe because of Clinton, certainly possible. But the reality is that's why Clinton was acquitted. Hope that answers your question. Other questions, comments on the Lewinsky scandal? Approval ratings were high. Yeah, Americans, they never dipped. They, for the most part, people probably even a lot of the younger vote even supported Clinton through the trial because to them it was awesome that the president was getting some while he was in the Oval Office. To others, especially the more traditionalists, the older population, it was looked at as being a stain on the presidency. That basically he was dragging the presidency through the mud to lower levels than it had ever been before. If the economy is good, moral compass is negligible. Other questions? So one of the questions is, so he went through the same process as Nixon? No, Nixon never got impeached. Nixon resigned before he got a chance to get impeached. Yeah, Nixon knew that he was going to get nailed because they had the smoking gun tape. So Nixon literally just said no. He just quit. So because he resigned and then got a full pardon from Ford, he never had to stand trial for it. So Clinton did go on trial. Trump also went on trial. Trump was impeached, and he was acquitted as well. And Andrew Jackson was also impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act, and he was acquitted. So we've never had a president that was officially removed from office. But to be impeached means that you stand trial. Yeah, so that's as far as the legacy of Clinton. That's where he gets his nickname Slick Willie, because essentially he was a guy that you couldn't pin anything to. You know, that here he is cheating on his wife in the Oval Office, and yet the American people still supported him. And a lot of it's because of the economy. The booming economy, I think, is what dulled America's moral compass, right? And so, yeah, obviously this cartoon basically goes into talking about, what's going on and stuff that would have never been talked about in a debate before, sexual frankness. This stuff that just had never been used on a large conversation before. All right, so in 2002, there were 288 million Americans. We begin to see large amounts of immigration from Mexico. And so what we're going to see, at least the trends as of 2015 or 2016 when the book was written, the trend was that by 2050, that whites will only make up 49% of the population. So we're seeing a tremendous influx of people from other places. We're seeing massive, influxes of Hispanic people. We're seeing, population rises in the Black community. We're seeing population expansion in many other areas, particularly Asian Americans. So eventually, it's going to be a much more diverse country by 2050 than what it would have been before. And so those are all examples of things that we're seeing as trends in Congress, as trends in government, as trends in social media are concerned. Those are all things that are happening even today. As far as social classes, and one of the things that I talk about with the lecture on Native Americans is that even by 2000, that Native Americans were still the poorest of all the ethnic groups in the United States by percentage. Right? They had the lowest percentage of healthcare. They had the highest levels of alcoholism, the highest levels of unemployment, and horrible poverty. The worst schools, right? Traditionally, many of those came from the American Indian community. Now, I don't know if things have changed, but I don't know if they have. Certainly, those are trends that have existed for some time. As far as other groups, they're growing, right? But the idea of the American dream was still somewhat elusive. Most CEOs in the United States today are white males. Most of the higher level positions are white males. White males tend to get paid higher per percentage than other groups do. So the reality is that it's still a country that is found wanting. Although things might be slightly better today than they were in the past, that the idea of inequality is still one that persists statistically and in reality. Right, but I don't have to tell you all about the struggle. It's something that many of y'all deal with every single day, right? You understand, that there's people who won't hire you because you're Hispanic or because you speak a certain way or because you have you have you look differently. Those are the kinds of things that you guys deal with every single day. So the reality is it's something that's still a reality in America. That things in the 90s may have been better than previous centuries, but they still have a long ways to go. Other issues, in particular, in a lot of minority communities, were the issues particularly of crime, teen pregnancy, homicide. 68% of African-American mothers were unwed in 2001. 2/3 of African-American children were on welfare by age 18. Certainly, a lot of places in the inner cities, the schools aren't very good. The hospitals were crap. Taxes are actually higher in many parts of the inner city than they are in the suburbs. So minority groups suffer disproportionately. We see that these are major issues that continue to persist in our inner cities even to this day. Right? These are all examples of things culturally that's going on. Another big reason for this is because of drugs. In the United States in the 90s, especially, teenagers were more likely to join a gang. Teenagers were more likely to recreationally use various kinds of drugs. I mean, certainly in the 70s, people used weed, but by the 90s, people are using meth, people are using angel dust, people are using PCP. There's all these other kinds of drugs that were on the streets, and certainly for kids and teenagers, it's going to wreck their lives. It's going to ruin them. I mean, I had friends that were addicted to meth, and they just were ruined. Right? I had a friend who was addicted to crack. You couldn't get off it. Heroin, all these things that, kids are dealing with, right? Kids see the effects of these in their communities, whether it be their parents or the people that are around them. So all of these, were part of this, welfare dependence, entitlement culture, poor education, and destructive, behaviors that led to essentially, people dying. Even today, large prison populations because largely drug use. And many of the people who go to prisons because of drug use and drug abuse. So I think a lot of this comes to a head in 1992 because there are massive race riots in Los Angeles. The Watts riots, which take place because a black man by the name of Rodney King was arrested after a high-speed chase. The drunken King was unarmed, but he was resisting arrest. And so policemen basically tasered him, and then numerous officers took turns basically kicking and beating him while people were filming it. So obviously in our time period, we're familiar with George Floyd, right? People are familiar with watching, George Floyd essentially being choked to death by a police officer. And that police officer, Derek Chauvin, just went to prison, right? For what, 20 years, 25 years? So the reality is that Rodney King demonstrated for many that police brutality towards minorities was a thing, something that most white communities just never even thought about before. And so despite the evidence of police brutality, they had these guys kicking and beating the shit out of Rodney King. They were found not guilty. So riots took place throughout central LA, particularly in the Watts neighborhood. And after 3 days of rioting, 44 people died, 1,800 were injured, and over $500 million in property were destroyed. The reality is that Watts is in South Central LA, and there aren't a lot of white neighborhoods in South Central LA. So the places where they rioted didn't have a lot of white people. The police officers were mostly white. They ended up rioting in Korean neighborhoods that ended up doing a lot of damage to other nearby ethnic neighborhoods that were not people that were police officers in those neighborhoods. So the reality is, even in South Central, a lot of the police officers, they live in other areas, and then they commute in to work. You're probably not going to live in Brentwood or Watts or any of these areas in South Central LA. And so because of that, Inglewood, those kinds of places. And so that's basically what was going on with Rodney King. A series of race riots that were sparked because injustice it basically just cemented for many people that injustice was real. And again, I know for most of us, you've seen it. It's this kind of stuff is going on, but for many people, who live in other places, just they don't think this happens. Other questions? So as far as the women's movement in the 90s, what we begin to see today is that women have made better strides in the last 30 years. Today, it's more likely that women will go to college, that they'll enter med school, make up the workforce. Women doctors, lawyers are much more common. Many women work outside the home. Some women are the primary breadwinners for their families. And so there still is a glass ceiling. If those of you aren't familiar with this term, it's the idea that women rise to a certain level and then stop because they're women. I know in particular, I had a boss that I worked for in retail. And I remember when I was an assistant manager, his response to me was, Raymaker, if you want to get ahead in this business, don't hire women. And he still works at the business that I used to work at. He's still there. So that's an example that I've personally witnessed. There are people out there that will not hire women, or if they do, they just won't promote them because there are certain stereotypes and misconceptions that are still out there. But the 90s was an example that things were getting better. right? That we're starting to see women CEOs. We're starting to see areas where women are starting to break through into professions that previously in the 60s and 70s you just didn't see a lot of, right? Many children were born single mothers, right? Single parenting was something you're not going to see as much of in the 50s and 60s. By the 90s, it happens. Divorce rates go up tremendously during the 80s and 90s. Today, I think it's at 57%. So it's more likely that you'll get divorced than stay married for a variety of different reasons. And I'm not going to wax poetic on how society's changed and that kind of stuff. That's up to you guys. You guys can make your own decisions about it. But ultimately, another major issue that comes into play is that of abortion. Many states began to sign laws in the 1990s that made it more difficult to get them. You can't make abortion illegal, right? Because Roe v. Wade guarantees women the right to one. But what they were doing was basically creating legislation that would make it harder, right? You have to get your parents' permission. There was a 72-hour waiting period. You'd have to do, there's all these hoops that you'd have to jump through before you could proceed to have one. Clinton refused to sign a bill that would have banned partial birth or late-term abortions. But later it was signed into law by GW, right? George W. Bush did sign that into law. And so the reality is during this time period, we're beginning to see that, it makes it more difficult for an abortion to take place. And that's, largely because there's a lot of conservative groups, that were fighting against it. And as of today, there are many states that are trying to get to a point where abortion will be illegal. Right, they're trying to find ways to circumvent the law or openly defy it. I think North Dakota's one. I know Texas is in there. I don't know if they've done it yet, but Oklahoma, North Dakota, many conservative states are mulling over the concepts of how they can get around this. So those are examples of things that carry on from the 90s even until today. As far as climate change, people began to become more aware of it by the 1990s. The numbers started coming out. There were issues like, for example, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker, which ran aground in Alaska, dumping millions of gallons of oil into the ocean. And so there were, people who became aware of Yucca Mountain, which is where most of America's nuclear waste is stored. And then, of course, Al Gore, who was vice president of the United States, came out with a series, Inconvenient Truth, which I think in many ways drew people's attention to what was going on. Whether Gore was hypocritical in creating the book because he flew around in private jets is subject to debate. But the reality is that the Clinton administration worked hard to keep environmental issues in the forefront. It was one of their major things they struggled with as a presidency. We also know, for example, that the Clinton administration had made steps basically to try to get into the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 to try to decrease emissions. So Clinton had attended it, but had never passed it through the Senate. George W. Bush just refused it altogether. And so even though 115 nations signed it, the United States was not one of them. And then later during the Bush years, SUV sales would go up tremendously. And even today, most of us drive SUVs, big trucks. The United States doesn't conserve gas as much as other countries do. And that's largely because gas has always been cheap. But over time, we're starting to see that those trends are starting to change. As far as movies and culture, one of the big issues of the 90s that plays a major role is AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. AIDS doesn't really make a huge splash until the 80s. Right. And then really by about 81 and after that, people started being diagnosed with it and people started understanding more about the disease and how it functions. AIDS essentially does not attack your body, it attacks your immune system. So it attacks your ability to fight off infections. So AIDS doesn't kill you. Infections that could normally be fought off by your body, like flu or cold, kill you, right? And certainly COVID. So as far as AIDS, it was a big deal in the 90s, especially because by 2002, 486,000 Americans had died of AIDS. Remember that AIDS was spread, number one, through sex, number two, needles. There were a variety of different ways in which it could be spread. And so people who were evangelicals actually liked AIDS because they thought that it was particularly a punishment for homosexuality. As we know today, anybody can get AIDS. It doesn't matter what your sexual practices are. If you have sex with someone who's infected, you can get it. If you share needles with someone who's infected, you can get it. And I think it became more mainstream when people like Rock Hudson, Liberace, and Magic Johnson, right, who has HIV, which is the state before you get AIDS. I think because of that, it made it more aware, people more aware of it and how it actually functioned. But even today, it's still a global pandemic. AIDS still exists. They have a variety of different cocktails that you can take that can control it, and they can keep your lifespan much longer than what it would traditionally be. But AIDS is still incurable, right? They've yet to find an ability to be able to, like COVID, where you can get vaccinated for, you can't get vaccinated for AIDS. So the reality is it still continues to this day. It's still something that still continues to kill people as of the present day, right? So as far as environmental trends in the 1990s and 2000s, big movies included Independence Day, Titanic, which I think was one of the highest grossing movies of all time, Twister. You had examples of actors like Jesse the Body Ventura and Arnold Schwarzenegger, who used their television appeal to eventually become political candidates themselves, and they did. Uh, TV shows that were important or big, at least culturally, reality shows. I put them in quotation marks because there's really nothing real about a reality show. It's mostly staged. Stuff like The Simple Life, which if you remember Paris Hilton, American Idol, which I think still is running today in some modified form, Survivor, right? These were shows, that tended to draw large audiences. Shows like channels like ESPN, sports became really big in the 1990s, from merchandising to television. Even today, if you go into a bar, chances are there's probably a sports game on. There probably isn't C-SPAN. You probably don't know what's going on if the Republicans or Democrats are voting for something that affects your taxes, right? You're more concerned whether or not somebody, got two 3-pointers in one game. And also, of course, the nature of software and corporate structure. Basically, many Americans purchased computers. 50% of houses had them by 2001. Microsoft Corporation became one of the largest on the planet. By the end of the decade in 2000, Bill Gates was the richest man in the world, right? I don't know if he is anymore. I think Jeff Bezos has passed him, but he, still is up there. And of course, he's going through a really messy divorce right now. So his wife, I think, became like the 18th richest person in the world just by divorcing Bill Gates. So you get an idea of how Microsoft and software are going to play a major role. We also see the increase of email use, internet gaming, right? These are all examples of things. The internet was kind of like the Wild West of the 1990s. It had originally been developed as a defense network in 1969, but kind of took on a life of its own. Was largely deregulated. Even to this day, there's still not a lot of regulation for the internet, so people can post pretty much whatever. You can find bomb-making materials on the internet. You can find people, who belong to radical groups that can find other people through the internet. And all of the attempts to try to limit the internet or to try to restrict it have all been shot down. For example, by the Communications Decency Act of '96 and some of the other major court cases that have approached the Supreme Court. So even today, the internet's still kind of the Wild West. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do on the internet that probably in 10, 20 years, you won't be able to do anymore. Companies like Amazon, eBay are going to spread tremendously, and today are household names. Weren't so in the 90s, but became so largely because of their abilities. And Amazon today just destroys retail businesses. You're going to see shopping malls like the one here in Harlingen. They're just going to shut down within the next 10 to 15 years because you can't compete with Amazon. So all of these, I would say, are big parts of the 1990s. One last thing I will talk about is Y2K. For those of you that lived through it, there was a software issue where when they would write code to save space, right, they would just put 99 for 1999. Well, of course, at the end of 99, it goes back to 0. Okay. Well, computers would have read that as 1900. Okay, they didn't know the difference between 2000 and 1900. So what happened was it was this event we call Y2K, which was the concept that everything was going to just like shut down, that all the computers would just blow up basically, and that because they couldn't read 00, that the whole world would just basically come to an end. It didn't. But I remember people had Y2K parties. I attended some of them where everybody thought the world would end and then everything was going to crash, and it wasn't that bad. There were some hiccups, but ultimately that was one of those kind of interesting things that you had to live through, because people today would be like, huh? kind of like what y'all experienced in 2012, right? But you know, the end of a Mayan cycle, everybody thinks that the world will come to an end. But as far as other aspects of the 1990s, 2000s, I will talk about Waco and Oklahoma City, and that's the last things we'll talk about, okay? Because people asked about these specifically. In 1993, there was a guy by the name of David Koresh, who was a self-proclaimed Messiah. He believed that he was basically like Jesus Christ. And he had a group of people that followed him that were called the Branch Davidians, and they camped out in Waco, Texas. Okay, the Branch Davidians had built this large house, and they all lived in this big compound. And it was supposed to be kind of like a commune, right, where they would live together and they worship together, and they could, you know, basically worship Christ the way that they desired to do so. Right. The issue was that the ATF wanted to shut these guys down because they had received word that these guys were buying illegal weapons. Right. They were basically sawing down assault weapons, which violated the Short Barrel Rifle Act. Okay. You have to have a 16-inch barrel on your assault rifle, and they were cutting them down. Well, the government's response is if you cut down the barrel of an assault rifle, it's because you're going to try to use it to kill people. All right, because it's you know, you're not going to shoot anything at 5-10 feet, right? You want something that's accurate at longer distances. That's why you would get an assault rifle. So the ATF essentially went in and wanted to shut these guys down, all right, for buying these illegal weapons or trying to sell illegal weapons. And so the FBI got involved, and it turned into a standoff. The Branch Davidians opened fire on the FBI, or the FBI opened fire on them first. Nobody knows who actually fired first. Both sides claimed the other. And it turned into a standoff for a while. And eventually the people that were trapped inside, you know, couldn't get out. The FBI went in with tear gas, and they tear gassed the building so that they could storm it and get the people out. The problem that they didn't realize is that tear gas, and they would have told you this in World War I, tear gas is extremely flammable, right? One spark and the whole thing goes up, right? And when they took this tank and tried to knock down the walls, it caused an electrical fire. And that fire essentially ignited all that tear gas, and the people burned up inside. So Koresh and all of his followers basically died inside the Waco compound, the ones that they didn't get out in time. So this and Ruby Ridge, which was another standoff in Idaho, where a guy was basically and his family were shot because the ATF was trying to collect weapons from them as well. People didn't trust the FBI a whole lot in the 1990s. So one of the guys that was at Waco, right, and had heard about Ruby Ridge was a guy by the name of Timothy McVeigh. He had served in the American Armed Forces. He had come home. He couldn't find a job. He became more radical. And he decided that the best way to strike against the FBI was to bomb one of their buildings. So in April 19th, 1995, right, on the anniversary of the Waco disaster, all right, he drove a U-Haul truck, parked it outside of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, and detonated it. And when the bomb exploded, 168 people died. It literally blew off half the building, right? I think there's a picture where you can see it. That's literally what the building looked like at the end. So it basically just blew off half the building. The thing that really sucked was that where he had parked was right next to a daycare center. So many of the people that had died were kids. And so I remember my school had taken up a donation, and many other schools had as well, for the people that had died. This essentially provoked a reaction. They began looking for who had done this. They traced the remnants of the U-Haul truck back to Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols essentially ratted out Timothy McVeigh, and they had basically these guys, you know, dead to rights, that they were the guys that were responsible for this. And so in 2001, Timothy McVeigh was convicted of the bombing at the Murrah Federal Building. I think the other guys took life imprisonment. And Timothy McVeigh himself was executed for what he did. And that was what was known as the Oklahoma City federal bombing. Right. You also had the Unabomber. So people in 1998 were afraid, right, because they get these funny packages and they just explode, right? Ted Kaczynski, right, was convicted of sending these various, you know, packages to people and then, you know, blowing them up. And he received life imprisonment in 1998. And lastly, school shootings. We began to see this was something that alarmed many people because nobody would have contemplated, right, that somebody would go in and shoot up a school. But Littleton, Colorado in 1999, right, the Columbine massacre, And obviously there have been many since, right, that have taken place. So these are all examples of levels of violence ramping up in the 1990s, right, from school bombings to the bombings of daycare centers and other kinds of things. So what's the overall thing? What do we take out of all of this, right? What were the 1990s? Why is it important to study them? Because the 90s were a decade that helped to shape us. In many ways, we see elements of what we deal with today, whether it be terrorism, whether it be uh, the fact that people don't trust their government, that we're kind of salty towards it, that Americans are more focused on trying to balance a budget, which is something that probably is never going to happen again, and the culture as well, right? There's elements of the 90s culture that eventually paves the way for what we're going to be experiencing today, right? From the budget deficits to the fact that we're starting to see the growth of minority populations to the idea that the American dream is still not a reality for all Americans. Civil injustice still takes place, right? Rodney King is in many ways comparable to what takes place with George Floyd and the aftermath that comes out of it. So I would say that in a lot of ways, the 90s helped to connect to our present day. And as of currently in 2021, this is essentially the last chapter that we study as far as the book is concerned. So I hope that all of you have enjoyed the course. I hope that you took something out of it. I hope that you can make some connections to your own life. And certainly I hope that it's going to be something that's going to help to prepare you, for what you do after it. Because, getting an A in the class is good, but, being prepped for life, I think, is the ultimate goal. So, it's one final time. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns on anything? All right, guys. Well, it was a pleasure teaching you guys. Really enjoyed the class and the insights that y'all had. And I hope that all of you do wonderful on the exams. I hope that you get your assignments in and hopefully have great finals in other classes as well. So have a great finals week. Take care of yourselves, and hopefully we'll see you down the road sometime soon.